On Mott Street in Lower Manhattan, there used to be a place with no English sign and no menu a tourist could read. The tables were round, the tea was free, and the kitchen never closed before midnight. A cook in that kitchen could turn a handful of dried shrimp, a knob of ginger, and last night's rice into something that made the whole block smell like home. That cook is gone. So is the restaurant. And so are most of the dishes he made. Number 14 was only served on one holiday, and most families stopped making it decades ago. Number 20 is not even Chinese, not exactly, but every bachelor in old Chinatown ate it twice a week. And number 11 required an oven that almost no restaurant in this country still uses. These were the foods that held Chinatown together when nobody else was paying attention. Hit subscribe, because here are 25 Chinese foods that fed old Chinatown, then disappeared. Number 25. Sizzling rice soup. The first sound you heard when this dish hit the table was a crack. Not a gentle sizzle, but a sharp, almost violent pop as scorched rice crust met hot broth. The rice had been dried on sheet pans in the back of the kitchen, sometimes for a full day, until it was hard as tile. Then it went straight into the deep fryer. The soup itself was simple: chicken stock, shrimp, a few slices of Chinese mushroom, snow peas, and a splash of rice wine. But the performance was the point. A waiter carried the broth in one hand and the fried rice crust on a separate plate, then dropped the crust into the liquid tableside. The explosion of steam and sound made every head in the restaurant turn. It was a staple of old Chinatown banquet halls from San Francisco to New York. By the 1990s, it had quietly slipped off most menus, replaced by dishes that did not require the theater. Number 24, original chop suey. The chop suey that most Americans know, the stir-fried vegetable and meat dish from takeout counters, was never the real version. In old Chinatown, chop suey meant whatever the cook had left over, and that often included organ meats. Chicken gizzards, pork kidney, tripe, and liver went into the wok alongside bean sprouts and celery. The sauce was thin, barely more than soy and a little oyster sauce, nothing like the thick brown glaze that came later. It was a laborer's dish, fast and cheap and filling. The name itself means odds and ends in Cantonese. When Chinatown restaurants started catering to non-Chinese customers in the mid-20th century, the organs disappeared from the recipe. The dish got sweeter, thicker, blander. The original version went with them. Number 23. Egg foo young. This was a thick, golden egg patty the size of a small plate, stuffed with minced pork, bean sprouts, scallions, and water chestnuts, then fried in a shallow pool of oil until the edges crisped and the center stayed soft. A ladle of thin, brown gravy went over the top. In the 1940s and 1950s, egg foo young was one of the most popular items in any Chinatown restaurant. It was cheap, filling, and it traveled well in a paper bag for anyone walking back to a rooming house. The dish had roots in Cantonese home cooking, where egg pancakes stuffed with leftovers were an ordinary weeknight meal. But the American version took on its own life. Chinatown diners served it with steamed rice and a cup of wonton soup, and for decades it was many Americans' first introduction to Chinese food. When Sichuan and Hunan cooking arrived in the 1970s, egg foo young started to seem old-fashioned. Menus dropped it. The griddle cooled. Number 22. Subgum wonton. Subgum was a word that appeared on Chinatown menus all through the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, and almost nobody under 50 knows what it means today. It meant many things mixed together. A subgum wonton was a generous bowl of broth loaded with shrimp, roast pork, chicken, bok choy, mushrooms, bamboo shoots, and plump wontons, all served in a clear broth with a few drops of sesame oil. It was not one protein in a pile of noodles. It was abundance in a bowl. Chinatown lunch counters served it as a full meal, and it cost just enough to feed a man for the entire afternoon. When menus simplified in the 1970s and 1980s, subgum vanished as a category. The word itself dropped out of use. Number 21. Salt fish fried rice. Most of old Chinatown's original residents came from Toisan, a rural county in Guangdong province. They brought with them a love of salt-preserved fish that bordered on obsession. The fish was dried until it was stiff as cardboard, then chopped into small pieces and fried in a wok with cold leftover rice, egg, and scallion. The smell was extraordinary. Sharp, briny, almost fermented, it could fill an entire hallway in a Chinatown tenement. The flavor was even stronger. Saltfish turned plain rice into something deeply savory, almost meaty, with a depth that no fresh ingredient could replicate. This was bachelor cooking at its most efficient. One dried fish bought from a shop on Canal Street could season a week of meals. When the bachelor generation aged out and families arrived after the 1965 immigration reform, saltfish fried rice faded from daily life. Number 20. Soy sauce Western steak. This was one of the strangest and most telling dishes in all of old Chinatown. A thin cut of beef, usually a cheap round steak, was pan-fried on a flat griddle and served on a sizzling metal plate with a fried egg on top, a pile of spaghetti tossed in ketchup, and a ladle of gravy made with soy sauce, Worcestershire, and sugar. It was not Chinese. It was not American. It was something that only made sense inside the walls of Chinatown, where a generation of men who worked in restaurants and laundries had spent decades watching what non-Chinese people ate without ever fully joining that world. The dish appeared on the menus of Chinatown coffee shops, which were a category of restaurant that almost no one outside the community knew existed. These were not dim sum parlors or banquet halls. They were small, fluorescent-lit rooms with formica counters and handwritten tickets, open early and open late, serving a hybrid cuisine that mixed Cantonese comfort food with approximations of diner food. A man could get congee for breakfast and a soy sauce steak for lunch in the same seat. The steak itself was never tender. It was not supposed to be. It was cooked fast and hot, slapped onto the plate with the egg still runny, and the whole thing was meant to be eaten with the spaghetti and gravy mixed together. It was filling, cheap, and it tasted like nowhere else on earth. Chinatown coffee shops began to disappear in the 1990s and 2000s as rents climbed and the customer base aged out. The soy sauce Western steak went with them. A few holdouts in Hong Kong still serve a version of it, but in American Chinatowns, it is almost entirely gone. If you ever sat in one of those coffee shops, you remember the fluorescent light, the clatter of plates, and the particular sweetness of that soy sauce gravy over a mediocre cut of beef. Number 19. Bitter melon stuffed with shrimp paste. If there was one vegetable that separated old Chinatown cooking from everything around it, it was bitter melon. Dark green, covered in ridges, and aggressively bitter in a way that most Western palates found unbearable. In Cantonese kitchens, the bitterness was the point. The melon was sliced into thick rings, hollowed out, and packed with a paste of minced shrimp, a little pork fat, salt, and white pepper. Then the stuffed rings went into a clay pot with a splash of stock and a drizzle of oyster sauce and braised until the shrimp paste set firm and the melon softened into something almost sweet at the edges. Grandmothers in old Chinatown served this as a centerpiece, not a side. Children hated it. Adults ate it without complaint. And when those grandmothers passed, nobody in the next generation picked up the clay pot. Number 18. 1,000-year egg cold plate. The egg itself was never actually 1,000 years old, but it looked like it might have been. Duck eggs were preserved in a mixture of clay, ash, salt, and rice hulls for weeks until the white turned amber and gelatinous, and the yolk became a dark, creamy green with a faintly sulfurous smell. In old Chinatown, these eggs were sliced into wedges and served cold on a plate with thin shreds of pickled ginger and a drizzle of soy sauce and sesame oil. It was a standard appetizer at dim sum and a common late-night snack in the rooming houses where bachelor laborers lived. The taste was unlike anything else, rich and mineral and faintly alkaline. Most Chinatown restaurants stopped putting it on the appetizer menu decades ago. Number 17. Bird's nest soup. The nests were real. They came from swiftlets, small cave-dwelling birds that built their nests out of solidified saliva on the walls of limestone caves in Southeast Asia. The nests were harvested by hand, cleaned strand by strand, and sold by the ounce at a price that made them one of the most expensive food ingredients in the world. In old Chinatown, bird's nest soup was the pinnacle of banquet cooking. It appeared at weddings, at New Year celebrations, and at the tables of clan association dinners where men who had saved for months pooled their money for one grand meal. The soup itself was delicate, almost flavorless, a clear broth with wisps of dissolved nest floating in it like pale threads. The flavor was not the point. The expense was. Serving bird's nest meant a family could afford to put something rare and precious on the table. There is something particular about the way a neighborhood forgets its own food. It does not happen all at once. One restaurant closes and another opens in its place with a different menu. A grandmother stops making a dish because her grandchildren will not eat it. A supplier retires and nobody replaces him. And then one day the dish is just gone, not banned, not rejected, just quietly abandoned. Old Chinatown lost its food the same way. Not in a single event, but in a long, slow exhale that took decades and left almost no record behind. Number 16. Lobster Cantonese. In the banquet halls of old Chinatown, lobster was the ultimate special occasion dish. Not broiled, not boiled, not served with drawn butter. Lobster Cantonese meant a whole lobster, shell cracked into large pieces, stir-fried in a wok with fermented black beans, garlic, ginger, ground pork, and a beaten egg that was stirred into the sauce at the last moment to create a rich, silky coating over everything. The egg sauce clung to the shell fragments, and eating it required your hands, a pile of napkins, and a willingness to work for every bite. The flavor was extraordinary. Salt from the black beans, sweetness from the lobster, richness from the pork and egg, all bound together by the searing heat of a restaurant wok running at a temperature no home stove could match. Chinatown banquet halls served this at wedding receptions and birthday celebrations for decades. As banquet culture declined and those grand dining rooms closed or downsized, lobster Cantonese became harder and harder to find done properly. Number 15. Tomato beef over pan-fried noodles. This was Chinatown comfort food at its most direct. Sliced flank beef, velvet-coated with cornstarch and oil, stir-fried fast with wedges of ripe tomato, a splash of ketchup, a spoonful of sugar, and a hit of soy sauce. The sauce was sweet and tangy and bright red, and it went over a nest of thin egg noodles that had been fried in a flat cake until the bottom was golden and crunchy. The combination of textures, soft beef, slippery tomato, crispy noodle, was something no other cuisine offered. It was on every Chinatown lunch menu for decades. Children ate it after school, workers ate it between shifts. Then menus moved on to Sichuan and Fujianese cooking, and tomato beef became a relic. Number 14. Ho Si Fat Choi, dried oysters with black moss. This dish appeared on the table exactly once a year, during Lunar New Year, and it was loaded with symbolism that mattered more than flavor. Ho Si Fat Choi sounds like the Cantonese New Year greeting meaning good fortune and prosperity. The dried oysters, hard and dark and chewy, represented good business. The black moss, a hair-like algae harvested in the deserts of northern China, represented wealth. Together, braised slowly in a clay pot with dried shiitake mushrooms, pork belly, and oyster sauce, they became the most important dish on the most important night of the year. The preparation took days. The dried oysters had to be soaked overnight, then simmered for hours until they softened into something tender and intensely savory. The black moss was rinsed carefully because it fell apart if handled too roughly. The braising liquid was built layer by layer, stock and soy and sugar and a little rice wine, until it reduced into a dark, glossy sauce that coated every piece. In old Chinatown, this was the centerpiece of the New Year reunion dinner, the meal where families gathered and bachelors joined clan association tables so nobody ate alone. Making Ho Si Fat Choi was not something a young cook attempted. It required knowing the exact moment the dried oysters had softened enough to absorb the sauce, but not so much that they fell apart. It required knowing that the black moss went in at the very end, stirred gently into the braising liquid just long enough to warm through. The generation that knew how to make it is thinning. Dried oysters have become expensive and difficult to source outside of specialty importers. Black moss was restricted from export by the Chinese government for environmental reasons, making it nearly impossible to find in American markets. Most families under 50 have never made this dish. The Cantonese greeting survives. The dish behind it does not. Number 13. Five-spice rolled pork belly. A whole slab of pork belly was rubbed with five-spice powder, a blend of star anise, cloves, cinnamon, Sichuan peppercorn, and fennel seed, then rolled tightly into a cylinder, tied with kitchen twine, and braised in soy sauce and rock sugar until the fat turned translucent and the meat fell apart at the touch of a chopstick. When it was done, the roll was cooled, sliced into thin rounds, and served cold as part of a combination platter at dim sum or during New Year. Every Chinatown butcher shop used to have these rolls hanging in the window next to the roast ducks and the strips of char siu. The aroma of five-spice and caramelized soy drifted out onto the sidewalk. Those butcher shops are closing one by one, and the rolled pork belly is leaving with them. Number 12. Carved winter melon soup. The melon was enormous, sometimes 2 feet long, with pale green skin covered in a white waxy bloom. In old Chinatown banquet cooking, the entire melon was hollowed out, filled with a broth of chicken, shrimp, ham, lotus seeds, and mushrooms, then steamed for hours until the flesh became soft and translucent and absorbed the flavor of everything inside it. The melon itself became the serving vessel. It arrived at the table whole, and a server ladled the soup out of it while the walls of the melon slowly collapsed. It was a spectacle dish reserved for weddings and major celebrations. The labor involved made it impractical for everyday service. When banquet culture faded, the carved winter melon went with it. Number 11. Wood-fired char siu. The barbecue pork that still appears in Chinatown today is not the same thing that used to hang in the windows decades ago. Modern char siu is made in gas ovens or convection roasters, and it is perfectly acceptable. But the original version, the one that came out of old Chinatown's wood-burning and charcoal-fired brick ovens, had a flavor that no gas oven can replicate. The process began with strips of pork shoulder, marinated overnight in a mixture of hoisin sauce, five-spice powder, fermented red bean curd, honey, rice wine, and soy sauce. The marinade turned the meat a deep red that darkened further during cooking. In the morning, the strips were hung on long metal hooks and lowered into a vertical brick oven fueled by hardwood or charcoal. The heat was intense and uneven, hotter at the bottom and cooler near the top, and the cook controlled the roast by raising and lowering the hooks at intervals. Fat dripped onto the coals and sent up bursts of smoke that flavored the meat from the outside, while the marinade caramelized from within. The result was pork with charred, lacquered edges and a smoky sweetness that went beyond what any sauce could provide. The fat rendered into something almost creamy, and the lean meat stayed tender from the slow heat. A good char siu maker could tell the doneness by sound, by the way the fat sizzled against the coals, and by the color of the smoke rising out of the oven. By the 1980s and 1990s, fire codes and health regulations made wood-fired ovens increasingly difficult to maintain in urban Chinatowns. The old ovens were dismantled. The men who knew how to read the fire retired or passed away. The char siu that replaced it is still good by any reasonable measure, but anyone who tasted the original knows the difference. Number 10. Steamed pork cake with salt fish. This was the kind of dish that never appeared on any restaurant menu but showed up on every Chinatown family's dinner table at least once a week. A mound of hand-chopped pork, never ground because the texture mattered, was mixed with soy sauce, sesame oil, cornstarch, and a generous amount of minced saltfish, then pressed flat into a shallow bowl and steamed over boiling water until the pork set firm and the salt fish melted into the surface. The top glistened with rendered fat, and the concentrated juices that collected around the edges were spooned over steamed rice. It took 10 minutes to prepare and 15 to cook. It needed no skill beyond knowing the right ratio of pork to salt fish. And yet, it was the flavor of home for an entire generation of Cantonese families in old Chinatown. When packaged ground pork and ready-made frozen meals became the default, the steamed pork cake lost its place on the table. Number 9. Lo Mai Gai, sticky rice wrapped in lotus leaf. A square of dried lotus leaf was soaked until pliable, then filled with glutinous rice mixed with chicken, Chinese sausage, dried shrimp, mushrooms, and a drizzle of oyster sauce. The leaf was folded into a tight parcel and steamed for over an hour until the rice absorbed the fragrance of the lotus and the filling and became a dense aromatic package that could be eaten with one hand. In old Chinatown dim sum parlors, Lo Mai Gai arrived on the cart, wrapped and steaming, and unwrapping it was part of the ritual. The lotus leaf gave the rice a green, slightly grassy perfume that no other wrapper could match. As dim sum service shifted toward smaller portions and faster turnover, the full-sized Lo Mai Gai shrank or disappeared from the carts entirely. The men who built old Chinatown did not write cookbooks. They did not film themselves cooking. They left behind menus printed on thin paper that yellowed and tore, a few photographs of kitchen interiors, and the memory of a smell that their grandchildren can almost but not quite place. When a cuisine exists only in the hands of people who learned it by standing next to someone older, it does not survive the moment those hands stop moving. Number 8. Chinatown almond cookies. These were not the almond cookies from a European bakery. They were round, sandy, pale gold discs made with lard, sugar, almond extract, and a single raw almond pressed into the center. The texture was crumbly and dry and slightly grainy, and they dissolved on the tongue in a way that no butter cookie could. Every Chinatown bakery had a tray of them in the window, stacked in rows next to the egg tarts and the coconut buns. They were sold by the pound in pink boxes tied with string. Children bought them after school with pocket change. Visitors to Chinatown brought them home as souvenirs. The bakeries that made them by hand with lard and real almond are mostly gone now. What remains is a factory-made version that does not taste the same. Number 7. War wonton soup. If subgum wonton was generous, war wonton was extravagant. The name likely came from a Cantonese pronunciation, not from any military association, and the dish was a massive bowl of broth filled with wontons, sliced roast pork, shrimp, chicken, bok choy, snow peas, water chestnuts, mushrooms, and sometimes crab. It was the soup version of everything in the kitchen combined with care. The broth was light, the proteins were cooked separately and added at the end so nothing overdone, and the wontons were hand-folded with a filling of pork and shrimp. In old Chinatown, war wonton soup was an event. It arrived in a bowl the size of a serving dish and fed 2 people easily. Ordering it meant you were hungry enough and flush enough to want everything at once. When Chinese restaurants simplified their soup offerings in the 1980s and 1990s, war wonton was one of the first to go. Too many ingredients, too much prep, too little margin. Number 6. Yin Yung fried rice. Half ketchup fried rice, half curry fried rice, divided on the plate with a clean line down the middle. This was another invention of the Chinatown coffee shops, the same hybrid restaurants that served soy sauce Western steak. The name meant mandarin duck, which in Cantonese culture symbolized a complementary pair. One half of the plate was tangy and sweet, the other was warm and spiced, and you were supposed to eat from both sides and let the flavors meet in the middle. It was playful and precise, 2 qualities that do not usually describe fried rice. The cooks who made it took pride in keeping the dividing line sharp. When the coffee shops closed, Yin Yung fried rice lost its home. It survives in Hong Kong, but in American Chinatowns, it is a ghost. Number 5. Braised phoenix claws. In Cantonese, chicken feet were called phoenix claws, a far more dignified name for what they actually were. The feet were deep-fried first until the skin puffed and blistered, then braised in a sauce of soy, oyster sauce, sugar, star anise, and fermented black beans until the skin became soft and gelatinous and the tiny bones could be sucked clean. The flavor was rich and sweet and deeply savory, all collagen and sauce. Old Chinatown dim sum parlors served them in small bamboo steamers, and they were among the most popular items on the cart. Younger generations raised outside of Chinatown lost their appetite for them. The sight of a chicken foot on a plate was enough to push the steamer away. The dim sum carts adjusted. The phoenix claws retreated. Number 4. Handmade mooncakes. The mooncakes made in old Chinatown bakeries for the Mid-Autumn Festival were nothing like the mass-produced versions sealed in plastic that fill the shelves today. They were made by hand in small batches. The pastry was thin and tender, yielding to the teeth with a slight oil sheen, and inside was a dense filling of lotus seed paste or red bean paste with a whole salted duck egg yolk buried in the center. The yolk was the moon. Biting through the sweet paste and hitting that salty, crumbly yolk was the entire experience. Some bakeries made versions with 5 types of nuts and cured meats mixed into the filling, a savory mooncake that tasted like a meal compressed into a disc. Old Chinatown bakers stamped each cake with a wooden mold that pressed a Chinese character into the surface. The molds were handed down. The bakers were not. When the last generation of hand mold bakers retired, the mooncakes became uniform. Number 3. Pork blood curd. In old Chinatown, solidified pork blood was sold in trembling dark red blocks at the butcher counter. It was sliced into cubes and added to congee, to hot pot, or braised with chives and fermented black beans in a wok so hot that the edges of the blood curd charred and crisped while the inside stayed soft and custard-like. The taste was mild, almost neutral, with a faint mineral note. The texture was what made it remarkable, smooth and dense and somewhere between tofu and liver. Cantonese families treated it as an ordinary protein, no different from a slice of fish cake. Children ate it in their morning congee without a second thought. It was cheap, nutritious, and it used every part of the animal. Health regulations made fresh pork blood increasingly difficult to sell in retail markets. The butcher shops that once stocked it either stopped carrying it or closed entirely. The dark red blocks vanished from the counter, and with them went a piece of old Chinatown that most people outside the community never knew existed. Number 2. Shark fin soup. For decades, this was the single most prestigious dish in Chinatown banquet cooking. A bowl of shark fin soup at a wedding reception or a clan association dinner was a signal of wealth, generosity, and respect. The fin itself was nearly tasteless. It had to be soaked for days, cleaned of cartilage and skin, then simmered in a rich stock of chicken and ham until the translucent strands of collagen softened into something silky that slipped across the tongue with a texture no other ingredient could match. The stock did all the work. Hours of slow simmering with whole chickens, cured ham, dried scallops, and ginger produced a broth so concentrated it was almost syrupy. The fin floated in it like threads of gold in amber. A small bowl at a banquet table represented hours of preparation and significant expense. That expense was the message. A host who served shark fin was telling the guests that they mattered. Old Chinatown's banquet halls built their reputations around this soup. It appeared on every wedding menu, every milestone birthday, every association banquet. Families saved for it. Restaurateurs sourced the fins from importers who brought them dried from Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. The dish collapsed under pressure from 2 directions. Wildlife organizations documented the practice of shark finning and launched campaigns that shifted public sentiment. Cities and states began banning the sale and possession of shark fins entirely. The old banquet halls could no longer serve the dish that had defined them. Some replaced it with a crab meat soup served in the same style. Others simply removed the course from the menu without comment. The symbol of arrival became the symbol of something else entirely. Number 1. Juk. Plain rice congee. The simplest dish on this list, and the one that held everything together. A handful of rice cooked in a large pot of water for hours, stirred occasionally, until the grains dissolved into a thick white porridge that was more liquid than solid. No meat, no vegetables, no seasoning beyond a pinch of salt. In the bachelor society of old Chinatown, where thousands of men lived alone in rooming houses because immigration laws had kept their wives and children overseas, juk was the first meal of the day and often the last. It could be made on a single burner. It filled the stomach and warmed the body and asked nothing in return. Every other dish on this list was built on top of that bowl of juk. The banquet dishes, the celebration foods, the stuffed and braised and fried creations that filled the menus of old Chinatown, all of them existed because there was always a pot of plain rice congee underneath, keeping a community alive through decades of exclusion. The pot is still warm. The hands that stirred it are not.